So jumping in, what we're going to take a look at is the student recruitment funnel as a whole, the tools that, some of the most popular tools that high ed marketers and the teams in admissions are using, as well as then how to actually get this end-to-end, top-to-bottom funnel tracking implemented for your institution. We'll walk you through a process that you can use, as well as then some of the gotchas that you'll encounter as you dig into that effort. And if we have time, we'll dig into some bonus content around call conversion tracking, custom channels, and SEO insights. So first up, the funnel. The student recruitment funnel is, aligns really nicely with your traditional marketing funnel. At the very top, where you're trying to build brand awareness and interest, you've got things like organic search advertising across both PPC display as well as social and content marketing efforts. As we slide down the funnel, you've got a lot more targeted pieces. We're looking to leverage retargeting, print mailings, really trying to, this is kind of this yellowish orange area is really where most admissions teams take over. The green section is the focus of largely those centralized marketing teams on campuses. And at the very end, you've got a direct person-to-person interaction with recruiters and the admissions staff, working around presentations, on-campus visits, things like that. The really big question that most marketers and sales teams, admissions teams are asking themselves is, how do we track the user journey throughout this funnel? The smaller micro conversions and points that may indicate that a prospect is engaged and interested, all the way up to the macro conversions that you see highlighted here around ad conversions, site or CRM conversions, and then the big one, the actual apply conversion. This deck and this talk will help us to map this out, and then hopefully you guys can take home a plan to begin conversations with your teams around filling in the gaps here. So the tools that we use. As high ed marketers, the MarTech and recruitment tool stack is wide, wide and deep. We're ranging from anything from social aggregators through SEO tools, PR, and brand mentions around like Meltwater. We have usually a number of content management systems that we're dealing with, as well as a handful of analytics and insights tools. We've got tools like Blackbaud that may integrate with our foundations. We also have mail and print pieces that a lot of families really rely on quite heavily throughout the recruitment process. And then we, of course, have those internal tools like SharePoint for intranets, as well as the big data pools around Salesforce, Slate, HubSpot, your CRM. So the big question here is, how do we capture all of the data that these tools are gathering, make sense of it, and then piece it together to get a picture of the full user experience from the top of the funnel down to the bottom? The answer lies in two really core tools. These are pretty low-hanging fruit for most institutions. There's a lot of support around them, and best of all, they're free. Most of you are probably already using these tools, Google Analytics and Google Data Studio. These two pieces will allow us to capture data from folks as they come onto our web properties, capture data through event tracking and things like that, micro conversions and macro conversions across those properties, aggregate them together, tie that in with actual conversions into the CRMs, and then spit that all out beautifully into dashboards in Google Data Studio. That's really, Google Data Studio for us is the tool that brings all of this together and helps us make sense of the data, cutting out the noise. This is an example of one of our Data Studio dashboards that we have for clients. This really just helps to surface the most important KPIs that folks want to keep an eye on and that they're going to use regularly in their marketing and admissions team stand-ups. So the big question is, now that we're pumped up, we want this, how do we make it happen? Before we dive into that, I would be negligent if I didn't take a second to talk about data privacy and security. I'm not a lawyer here. If you want legal advice, get it from a qualified professional at your institution. But really, as marketers and admissions professionals, it's our duty to make sure that we are using this consumer data, we're collecting it ethically, and we're storing it responsibly. Make sure that you guys are, staying up to date with the changing privacy landscape. It's moving really quickly these days with GDPR, CAN-SPAM, the California Consumer Privacy Act. It's really rolling. Just make sure that you guys are covering your bases, especially when it comes to HIPAA, FERPA, any of that type of data that you guys are handling. Just make sure that you're following the terms and conditions of each of these tools as well. And I'll have a few sprinkles here for you guys to help you along this data privacy path. First thing that we want to do is start by making sure that our Google Analytics accounts, properties, views, and filters are all configured correctly. Because as we're gathering all this data and we're using it to make decisions and help us to inform, what for most of us amounts to pretty big pools of money around ad spend and things like that, we want to make sure that the data that we're making these decisions on is sound. We'll take a look at Google Analytics, and we really want to make sure that this core tool is present on all of our primary web properties. This might include Unbounce for landing pages, Drupal, WordPress for your website. Most of us have some sort of knowledge base tool that folks are using. I want to make sure that we're able to track our visitors across all of these different properties. Ideally, we would do this via Google Tag Manager. Here's an example of the Google Analytics page view tag. Really straightforward in Google Tag Manager, a little bit more finicky if you're going to be injecting the code yourself. One of the things that we like to do when we first dig into any Google Analytics account, and you can see this pictured in the views column here, is create several views. The first and most important is the raw data view. This raw data view is going to be totally unaltered data, no filters, no bot filtering. We aren't manipulating or destroying data in any way here. This is kind of your baseline and your source of truth to check back against and make sure that any of your filters that we're applying, like rewrites or anything that might be destructive to data, it'll be your way to test and make sure that things are going according to plan there. We also then will create several views based on audience. So one for our internal audience and external audience, like families and prospective students. This helps us to really kind of filter out that internal noise that a lot of college web properties have, to really make sure that we're paying attention to the traffic that's really going to be targeted and impacted by our marketing and recruitment efforts. We also then have several test views, which we call sandboxes. These are variants of our audience-based views. And these are a place for us to test out new filters and things before we put them into one of the production views, just to make sure that, again, if we are dealing with any destructive or data-altering filters, that we aren't going to mess up our views that we're relying on to drive our dashboards. I recommend that these accounts are owned by a generic or shared account at the institution, and then individual permissions are given to individual users at the account property and view level as needed. This will help to make sure that when someone leaves the institution, you don't lose access to all of your data. I also would recommend that you enable benchmarking and select education as your industry. This will help you guys if you don't have easy access to competitor data or other industry benchmark data. Google has a great pool of data that you can use to help with your benchmarking and see where you guys are at. Another big thing in this account setup is going to be the data processing amendment that Google requires as a part of the GDPR changes. This is going to be really important that you have someone from your organization's legal team read through, consult with, and accept. Unfortunately, Google is kind of a take it or leave it opportunity here. When it comes to Google Analytics, you can't modify that data processing agreement. If you want to use the platform, you have to accept the terms of it. Some legal departments have issue with that, and so oftentimes you'll see a little shadow IT here by users who maybe aren't allowed to accept those terms, clicking the button and just moving on so that we can use the tool. I wouldn't recommend that, of course, but that is something that we've seen pretty regularly. At the property view, what we are looking for here is just making sure that when we're considering even naming conventions, that we're taking time to reflect on the scope of the websites and the traffic that we're looking to track with this property. For instance, most organizations will have one property that they then deploy a single tracking snippet with cross-browser or cross-domain tracking rather enabled on across all their different domains and web properties. This will allow you to really see the entire user journey and get the big picture across platforms, whereas otherwise, when you jump platforms, it would be a black hole of that data. You wouldn't be able to stitch it together. Another thing here to make sure that you've got set correctly is your HTTPS on the default indicator. If you haven't made the switch, you definitely need to. Google confirmed in late 2019 that secured site is a signal that's going to measurably affect your queries. So another thing to keep in mind is in this advanced settings here, you're going to see the tick box for allowing manually tagged items to override the Google Ads settings. This will be really important to make sure that you have enabled, and we'll talk about why a little bit later on. There are several other options here within the property setup that I would encourage you to take advantage of, including the demographics and interests pieces to enable remarketing and advertising data. This is going to give you a whole bunch more data around who's coming to visit your site, as well as enhanced link attribution and in-page analytics reporting. If you've got internal links or JavaScript and things like that, JavaScript-based links, this will help to track all of that and give you much deeper insights into how folks are using your internal linking structures. Two really big ones within this property setup are integrating with Google Search Console as well as Google Ads. These are really going to help you to pull more pieces of this massive MarTech puzzle together. Really easy to step through, pretty much just a wizard where you log into the other tools, click accept and allow, and you're good to go. A new feature that Google has rolled out over the course of late 2019 and early 2020 here is Google Signals. This began as a beta project back in 2018 on select accounts. Google Signals enables cross-device reporting and marketing. When you activate this, existing analytics account features are going to be upgraded. You're going to get a bunch more information from Google users, which is pretty much everyone, but this is limited to folks who have ad personalization turned on. The areas where you're going to see this enhanced information is going to be specifically around remarketing. You're going to be able to target remarketing ads to users across their devices. This really hasn't been within reach in any reasonable, fiscally responsible way up until Google Signals rollout. And so it's something that you should definitely be taking advantage of. Another feature is ads reporting. You're going to get a lot more information about these users, as well as your demographics and interest reports. It's going to be even more beefed up than what it would be with just the standard demographics and interests enabled. And then you're also going to get cross-device reports. This is going to aggregate user behavior and browsing sessions across devices. That's going to allow you to see the user journey from folks who are skipping across devices, which is, again, pretty much everyone. Student may be looking at your site on your phone, on their phones, their tablet, and then they're switching to their laptops or desktops when mom and dad become involved later on down the road. So digging in a little bit deeper to this Google Analytics account setup, in the view area, we really want to make sure that, again, we're setting up these views that I talked about earlier, just to make sure that you're able to parse the data accurately and based on your need later on down the road when it comes time to build your dashboards. One big piece here is in the individual view settings to make sure that you're excluding URL queries for data privacy. This would be things like any tools that pass form data via URL variables. This is going to be a lot of landing page tools. I know that Unbounce does this definitely. And so what you need to do is regularly make sure that you have an exception list here for any form fields and variables that may be passed that contain PII. Otherwise, that PII is going to end up in Google Analytics, and that's a violation not only of Google Analytics terms and conditions, but also the terms and conditions of the landing page tool or whatever tool you're using, as well as a violation of GDPR and other data privacy related laws. One big thing that most folks overlook is ticking this bot filtering box. You'd be surprised at the impact on traffic that bots can have on your site. Mostly non-Google bots. So make sure that you check this, especially on the views that you're going to be relying on to gather your data, especially around that external view, where you're going to be focusing on how effective is my marketing spend. One other piece here that can be really helpful, this is more on the internal side, is to enable site search tracking. This will help you to identify trends and things happening on campus, as well as help you to refine your own SEO, both externally and internally. Make sure that the search results on your internal search appliance are yielding helpful results. So digging in another level deeper here, this is where a lot of the guts come in around these views. The first thing that you're going to want to do is make sure that you have a series of normalizer filters enabled. This is going to do things like normalize case, remove special characters and things. Because Google treats capitals and lowercases as variants on the same word, say capital L lowercase versus lowercase l lowercase, that's going to count as two different things, and you'll have to manually reconcile all those later on in your reporting. That's going to create a nightmare for you. So one of the first things that we do is jump in and begin normalizing the data. That makes the number crunching on the backside that much easier. The second and probably most important filter that you're going to do, and this is what we call a destructive filter, is rewriting the request URI to include the host name. This is going to be vital if you're going to be doing anything related to cross-domain tracking. The reason being is that Google will treat the index page, for example, or a contact page at /contact. It's going to aggregate that /contact from 5 different sites that you have cross-domain tracking enabled on. It's going to aggregate all of those under one /contact entry. Without the host name appended, you're just going to see 5 different sites worth of data funneled into that one entry. By prepending and rewriting the host name onto the request URI, or essentially the path, the page path, we're going to get, for example, www.08.agency/contact. We're going to see that as one entry. And then we're going to see subdomain.08.agency/contact. The contact page for that second site will then become its own line item. And this will really help us to make sense of the data, especially when it comes time to look at it in the context of a user-visitor flow. This can be a little bit confusing, and so I've given the exact formula and example here on how to do this. So moving on. This next filter is going to filter out any non-production traffic to your site. What do I mean by non-production traffic? This means that your production web server, usually www.yourdomain.edu, that's going to have several variants for development, staging, etc. Google Analytics will accept any data that's being sent to it with your Universal Analytics ID attached, regardless of what site or domain that's coming from. So what that could mean is that you get a bunch of traffic from people editing and testing the site that's throwing off your actual analytics for your views. What we want to do is set a filter pattern using a regex that contains all of the domains and subdomains that we want included in our data set. This will be really important to make sure that you have this, you're really thorough in this, because if you don't accidentally include a domain that's a production site or property, none of its data is going to be gathered and aggregated in these views. It will, however, be gathered and aggregated in the raw data view. So that's your fallback there. One other thing that we can do to help tease out the noise of internal users is to create a filter that excludes IP ranges. This can be helpful if your campus doesn't have its own host name or service provider name, which is another field that you can filter on. You can usually get the list of your external facing IP addresses from your IT team, and you can throw those in here with a regex again to exclude that traffic on your external only views, so that you're doing just a little bit more there to make sure that you're really trying to target those prospective students and their families as much as is possible. And one final thing is to set up a few views that can be helpful. Here's an example of one that we use with our clients relatively frequently. This is an external production only traffic view. This essentially allows you to create reports that show your overall site traffic versus your prospective students and their families specifically. Here we're doing this using a number of indicators. The first one here is the service provider, the internet service provider. Most large universities are their own ISP, and so this is a really easy way to filter out that on-campus traffic. The other one is making sure that we're only, again, including the domains and web properties that are production-based. We want to filter out all the noise from those site creators and content contributors. And this last chunk here is leveraging event tracking, which we'll jump into in just a bit, that highlights a few really popular events that internal audiences would do. These usually include things like clicking into your online learning platform, your webmail, those really common utility links that are found at the top of most university sites, where they're almost exclusively used by those internal audiences. Combining all these things filters out the noise again and helps us to get at those prospective students and their families, so that the data that we're looking at is as pure as possible, making sure that, again, the decisions that we're making based on these reports and dashboards is sound. So campaign URLs are going to allow us to track our efforts primarily at the top of the funnel. This is going to be at that acquisition stage. These campaign URLs are going to tell us where folks are coming from, what campaigns, medium, source, those types of things. This is going to connect those inbound and outbound efforts to our macro and micro conversions across the site. This can also be used to track calls to action from print pieces by using a URL shortening service with a campaign URL behind it. Here's an example breakdown of kind of the matrix that we use to help us organize all the different touches within one campaign. So here we have our admit to yield campaign. We've got several sources. We've got some emails coming from our CRM, which you can see down that first column. The next column is a direct mail print piece that we're sending to admitted students. The third column is going to be a text message that's being sent from our CRM to encourage admitted students to apply for scholarships. And the last column is going to be a PPC campaign that we're running around financial aid. So what we would do is we would establish a specific variable here, the source in this first example. The source is going to be the CRM. The email is going to be the medium, and the weekly accept email, that's going to be the content. These pieces combine into what you see along the bottom of the screen there as a campaign URL. These are using UTM variables of source, medium, content, and campaign. All of this aggregates together to help us see when visitors come into Google Analytics that they came from the admit to yield campaign, specifically the email that came from our CRM around that weekly accept. Then if someone completes a conversion or maybe even submits an application for a scholarship, we can then tie that success factor back to the individual campaign, as well as then the individual touch within that campaign. One really important thing to think about as you're planning these URLs, it's really important to be consistent and to document your work across your team. The reason being is that, if people are using variations on email, say email plural, email from CRM, for instance, Google is going to treat each of those variables as a completely different entry. By being consistent in using email across all of the touches that are email based, you're going to ensure that you can then sort and roll up all of this data really easily on the back end. Otherwise, if you're using variations on these things, you're going to have just a gigantic mess that you're going to have to manually combine all the different variants into one thing, either using exports from analytics into spreadsheets, things like that. So avoid the headache, be consistent, pick like underscore here you'll see for text separator, and avoid the redundancy and duplication, really important later on. So here's an example of what that can look like if you're not being consistent. So here you'll see in the campaign column that we've got a lot of what looks like just junk. These are coming from email campaigns that with variables for the campaign that were dynamically generated by the email platform here, MailChimp. And so one thing that you can do is, a lot of these tools like Google Ads, MailChimp, they'll dynamically generate these variables for us, which can be helpful in some cases if we don't have a plan up front. But hopefully coming out of this presentation, you'll see the value of being consistent and having a plan around these variables. You can choose to override these dynamically generated variables from these tools and insert your own so that they align correctly with that tracking matrix that we just saw. Again, this will help make the reporting on the back end much easier. If you have what you see on the screen right now, you're going to have to manually know and keep a separate spreadsheet that says this campaign with 53566A, that relates to campaign A, but then the next one relates to campaign B. And you're going to have to manually again crunch those numbers together in order to get the bigger picture on the success of that campaign. Regarding cross-domain tracking, I've talked a lot about it. Now that we can see using these campaign URLs and these UTM parameters, which inbound and outbound efforts are bringing visitors to our site or different web properties, we're going to jump into how to examine their user journey across those web properties throughout those light green and yellow phases in the funnel. This is going to relate directly to Google Analytics. And again, a lot of those same web property generating tools like Unbounce, our KB solution, Blackbaud, as well as then potentially our CRMs and the landing pages that are created there as well. Cross-domain tracking is going to allow us to, again, view the entirety of the user's journey across all these web platforms and the tools that are used throughout the funnel. To get this set up, the easiest way to do this is to do it through Google Tag Manager. This is also Google's preferred method. Really simple. What you're doing is you're just ticking a few boxes, and then you'll see on this slide under the auto link domains, just a comma separated list of the domains that you'd like to be included in your cross-domain tracking. This should generally be exactly the same as the list of production-only URLs that you created for your filter. Some really rare cases or unique use cases, these will be different, but for most folks, these should be the same. You want to also make sure that you're turning on auto link domains, just so that you don't have to manually link them together. Some customized instances of Google Tag Manager, you'll do that, especially if you're using several individual accounts and then one roll-up account. Really important to keep in mind that, again, you want to use this in conjunction with those filters, and that your raw data view, which doesn't have any filters on it at all, it's going to gather all the data that your Google Analytics ID is sending back to Google, regardless of whether or not they're included in this cross-domain regex or comma-separated list here. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at your raw data view. You're going to see a lot of host names that probably don't belong to you. Those are probably sites that have scraped content from your site, including your analytics snippet, and now are sending back usage data to Google Analytics. And this is one where you're going to definitely want to make sure that you use that rewrite hostname filter. Otherwise, you're going to have a mess in trying to figure out which pages go to which sites. Here's an example of the cross-domain tracking with a manually injected Google Analytics snippet. The lines that we're going to want to pay special attention to are the ones where we're requiring linker, and we're setting the linker auto link. The blurred out area is just the regex from a client that we've worked with that has the whitelist of the domains that would be included here. You can also then include the link ID and instantiate linkid.js, which will help to give you the enhanced link analytics that we talked about earlier. And you'll also want to make sure that the auto linker is enabled on the line where you've inserted your Google Analytics Universal Analytics ID number. Hopefully you aren't using this version anymore, but if you are and you'd like some help, my email is on the last slide. You can reach out and we'll see what we can do for you. So now that we are gathering data from all of our different web properties, we'll want to set up event tracking. Here again, we're going to want to make sure that we have a really solid plan and we're being consistent and documenting our work for our colleagues. Without that documentation, you're likely going to have a nice little mess in a few years. Event tracking is going to allow us to track the macro and micro conversions across our different web properties, giving us insights into the conversion rates as our users progress down the funnel. The first step in doing this is establishing KPIs. Here you can see an example of our KPI document that we use with our clients. We use this to differentiate between our macro and micro conversions and help us to identify metrics and things that will be helpful for diagnosing any issues that these KPIs may surface. This example, I've redacted it to protect our client's secret sauce, but really what this outlines is essentially, usually for higher ed institutions, the big three around connection, engagement, and then the apply, RFI, that kind of stuff. Once you've established those KPIs, we move to an event tracking matrix. Several items have been redacted here as well to protect any proprietary information. But this helps us to, just like with the UTM, those campaign variables, make sure that we have consistency across all of our implementations here. Really going to be important to be consistent for all those same reasons that it was with the campaign variables. Without that, we'll have a gigantic mess where, so it's very important to have a consistent structure here. We recommend lowercase with underscores or dashes to separate your words in your event, action, and event label categories. You can also ensure consistency by making sure that you've set up those normalizing filters in Google Analytics. So now that we have the matrix planned, the easiest way to implement this event tracking is through Google Tag Manager. You'll see an example of what that looks like here. We've got several events around submit-related actions that a user would take on the site. We're able to track scroll depth through Google Analytics, which is awesome. You can also have supplementary tools like Crazy Egg or Hotjar that track that. You can get that data right here in Google Analytics too, really easily. We also have CRM submissions right in here as well, and RFIs to help tie those very important macro conversions straight back into the campaigns and the campaign variables that we identified earlier. This is going to help us at a glance know which of our marketing efforts are working and which aren't. Some other common user interactions that we can track through here are downloads of PDFs and other documents, as well as video plays, how far a user got in a video, specifically YouTube, embedded on your site, phone number clicks, outbound links, all kinds of options here. If you don't have Google Tag Manager, this is a way that you can implement these manually with inline code. You'll see the on-click component of this anchor tag that's identifying this as an event. The category is going to be file, the action is going to be download, and that label is going to be brochure. This aligns directly with the columns in the matrix that we saw earlier. One really nice thing that Google Analytics and Google Tag Manager put within reach is custom dimensions. Here again, it's important to have a plan and be consistent and document your work. I probably sound like a broken record, but none of us like to inherit something that has no documentation. These custom dimensions are going to allow us, this is going to allow us to create special properties that can be tracked throughout the funnel. This is really commonly used to differentiate or identify user types based on logins or other actions that a user may take, or even based on where they're coming from. You can see here in Google Analytics, you first set up the custom dimension in the property, in the custom dimensions settings there under custom definitions, and then you would create a corresponding entry variable within Google Tag Manager that injects that data into the data layer with a variable. What this then allows us to do is, again, track here the user type, but we'll see a little bit later on some other creative ways that this can be used as well. Now that we have all this information, it's really helpful, because we have created such a large pool of data through all this work, to highlight and surface what's most important to us through goals. The goals are largely going to correspond with those macro conversions, or those really big steps that people are taking. Again, around ad conversion, site or CRM conversion, and the apply conversion. By setting up specific goals, we can track the conversion rates as users progress down each step of the funnel here. Here's an example of several common goals set up in Google Analytics around RFIs, visits, and applications. The goals will help us at a glance to identify which channels are working best for RFIs, visits, apps, donations. We can also set up engagement goals based on things like, say a user reaches 50% or more of a video, to help identify and pull up information around audience building. This will also help us to identify which social channels, for instance, are getting the most leads on lead gen forms, which geographic locations are converting the best. This can sometimes be really interesting when paired with demographic information, and give us new insights for our admissions teams and how they're targeting different geographic areas. This can also help on the foundation side to help identify which campaigns are leading to more donations or volunteer signups. So now we have boatloads of data from the top of the bottom, from top to bottom of the funnel. Now what do we do with it? Here's where the magic really happens, and that's through integrations. Using APIs and built-in integrations, we can pass data across all these different platforms and tools to make our reporting lives so much easier. One example here is passing data from a form to MailChimp. This is based on the program type, program ID, and program category. This is going to align with a lot of your academic program and interest-based information that your admissions team really wants to have gathered from prospects. This allows you to begin building a profile before the user even gives you their name and email address, which is really super. It helps to really advance that profile building and get our admissions teams that valuable information earlier in the process. That same principle, just as a side note, can be used to integrate with different CRMs as well, which is really helpful. One other really common integration is Google Search Console. This is low-hanging fruit, something that you can integrate directly with Google Analytics. And this is going to, the big data set that you're going to love here are the queries, the search queries that folks are using when they type in to Google. Analytics has query data already, but the vast majority of it is going to be protected, and it's going to say keyword not set. By integrating with Google Search Console, we can then get that data that would otherwise be not set and hidden to us within Google Analytics. The next one, again, really low-hanging fruit, very easy to integrate, is Google Ads. This is going to give us enhanced keyword reports, as well as enhanced campaign and acquisition data around our digital advertising efforts. We saw a MailChimp example earlier, but one thing that I want to note here is that MailChimp also makes it really easy for any of you using any sort of e-commerce platform, whether that's for donations, CE courses, your bookstore. You can set up enhanced e-commerce tracking through Google Analytics and integrate that directly with MailChimp with just a few clicks to get you actual dollars and cents earned from individual campaigns within your email marketing platform there. Super awesome data to have. Hotjar is a really popular, very cheap tool that gives you lots of different insights, specifically their visitor playbacks. We can make visitor playback sorting and sifting. It can be really overwhelming, but we can make that a lot easier by pairing a Hotjar tag and firing that and sending that data to Hotjar when a Google Analytics event happens. This might look something like we have a form for our RFI, and we have an event that fires on that RFI form submission. That, at the same time, can fire a Hotjar tag to Hotjar that says, hey, the user who you've been recording their playback with, they just submitted this really important form for us, and it flags it as such in Hotjar so that you can then filter out all of those really helpful high importance playback journeys and really sift through all the other noise that exists within that playback pool. Google Data Studio is, again, kind of the linchpin to all of this from our perspective. This is where we aggregate the data from all of these different sources using data connectors. A lot of the most popular tools have free data connectors available. Really, you can get that set up in just a few clicks most of the time. Data Studio makes interactive reporting web pages that can also be output to PDFs. Regular reporting can be done much easier and much more quickly. You saw this example earlier in the slide deck, but here are just a few others of Google Data Studio in action from some of our clients. You'll see how really easy it is to get at that most important data here, especially around scheduling a tour. Super information to have from the marketing team's perspective right off the bat, and you can dive into each of these sectors really easily. They tie back into the more in-depth Google Analytics or source data reports with just a click. One tool that a lot of our clients use or are starting to use is HubSpot. This is an alternative CRM to Salesforce. It's more general purpose than higher ed specific or recruitment specific CRMs like Slate. But using HubSpot or other CRMs, we can really close the loop on our marketing efforts. And by doing that, we can then get a direct correlation of our marketing and admissions efforts in dollars in the door via ROI on specific campaigns and efforts. Here's an example of what that would look like within HubSpot. We'll see that this particular ad campaign has yielded for this client 16 contacts, and I've blurred out the conversion rate and the deal count just to protect that client's secret sauce again. So this is really the gold standard. This allows us to get from start to finish, calculate our ad spend, and then from there automatically calculate an ROI for that specific campaign. Really the stuff that marketers are dying to get their hands on.